those of you who do not know, Voices and Votes is a nonpartisan celebration of our history in voting rights, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It supports a traveling exhibit of the Smithsonian Institution on display in the Aiken County Historical Museum all the way through September 2nd. So for those of you who have not gone by to see the exhibit, please make sure you take the time to do so. Voices and Votes here in Aiken has offered 16 events, starting from February, ending this weekend. That's a lot of events, y'all. A lot of planning. All events have been supported entirely by community donations. So did we make money? No. Did we spend a lot? Yes. But that all went to a good cause. So we want to thank all of our sponsors. We want to thank anyone who had anything to do with Voices and Votes. Starting when we had this idea last year, but then also, of course, until now. I want to make sure that we plug our last event. Our last event is called One Woman, One Vote. It is a book talk on the book One Woman, One Vote. It is presented by its researcher at the Center for African American History, Arts, and Culture this Friday at 6 p.m. That is this Friday, August 26th, 6 p.m. at the Center for African American History, Art, and Culture. To register or donate, you can definitely go to aikenvoicesandvotes.com. Remember, did we make a lot of money? No. Did we spend a lot of money? Yes. And so all of your donations actually go towards the cause to make these things happen. None of this is something that anyone got paid to do. This is all work that we did because we care about some people. Hey, it's okay. Hey, it's all right. Volunteer. And so the great thing about what we've done so far, again, it's been through community donations, but it's allowed us to really hone in on what we want to highlight in our voting rights history, regardless of how you identify, right? But this particular conversation tonight, or this particular play, and the panel that we're going to have later on is going to talk about those voting rights, specifically around race and gender. So now let's get to the nitty-gritty, because we've gotten all of those formalities out of the way. I want to introduce to you our moderator for the panel discussion tonight. For those of you who do not know, Dr. Valencia Johnson. No. Okay. Clap for them. You're true. So Dr. Johnson is an associate professor of sociology and co-director of the African American Studies minor here at the University of South Carolina, Aiken. She's earned her bachelor's degree in sociology from Norfolk State University and her graduate degrees in sociology, criminology, and women and gender studies from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Though not a historian, Dr. Johnson has a deep appreciation for African American history, art, and culture. A native of Lynchburg, Virginia, she lives here in Aiken with her husband, Eugene White Jr., her dog son, Walker Rufus, and her daughter, Bullseye. Dr. Johnson, everybody.
Thank you all so much for being here this evening. So before we get started, we're going to do some introductions of our panelists. So first we have Dr. Walter Curry. And Dr. Walter Curry is a native of Orangeburg, South Carolina. Bachelor's degree in political science from South Carolina State in Women and Gender Studies. She received her PhD from the University of South Carolina and is currently working with USC as the digital editor of the papers of the first South Carolina Volunteers, one of the first Black regiments formed during the Civil War. Her book on South Carolina women and succession is under contract with Cambridge University Press. And then we have Dr. Sarah King. She is a historian of the United States in the 20th century. She received her PhD in history in 2019 and began teaching at USC Aiken in 2020. Her work explores popular culture and activism in the 1960s and 70s. Before moving to South Carolina, Dr. King lived in Rochester, New York, for 5 years, where she regularly walked past monuments honoring Douglas and Susan B. Anthony and the Susan B. Anthony House. Let's give her a hand. So we have a short-ish panel discussion for you, but you all can also participate in our discussion tonight. So if you haven't already, you can scan the QR code that's behind us, and if you have a question, submit that QR code. And Dr. Hodges is going to bring me out a tablet here in a moment, and I will be able to receive those questions to ask our panelists. Also, we have our actors on stage as well. So if you have any questions for our actors, we will take those too. All right, so go ahead and get out your phones now and start staring at the screen there, and hopefully you can get that thing to come up on your phone. So, did we all learn something tonight? Yes. That's awesome. So there were a lot of themes that really popped up throughout the play, and some resonated with me. And I just wanted to listen to people well. I was not expecting to talk about hair. All right. So some of the themes that I saw, of course, friendship was one of the biggest ones, right? But also racism, sexism, freedom, other microaggressions, bias, power, even police brutality. But before we get into the heavy lifting of kind of unpacking some of these themes, let's do one of those critics questions. So panelists, what did you think about the performance?
Yeah, I'm saving my name. But a lot of things that came out from the play. Actors, I did a wonderful job. I think what stood out to me were two things: racial oppression and gender oppression. And Frederick Douglass, an orator, someone who was empowered by his voice, he spoke on the fact that racial oppression was evident even after the end of the Civil War into the Reconstruction era. And when he spoke about racial oppression and the 15th Amendment, he basically said that, first of all, he was a slave, and slaves didn't have any rights according to the Dred Scott decision. And so the 15th Amendment gave us, as African Americans, the right to vote and expanded suffrage. And so he was talking out of that from the context in which he was observing and experiencing. Also, when we look at Susan B. Anthony, she also spoke from her experience as a woman and how women's voices were silent during that time, and the gender oppression as it relates to women. And that's one of the reasons why she supported women's suffrage. And so those two themes, racial oppression and gender oppression, stood out to me.
Thank you.
It really is a very good Frederick Douglass wig. Like the picture that you always put up of Frederick Douglass nitty-gritty of constitutional language and whether or not to add like male to the Constitution for the first time, there's always the question of like, is this going to be interesting for you guys? And so I think the really kind of seamless incorporation, the mentions of like the Kansas referendum, which really gets glossed over. Yeah, it was entertaining and also like honest to the nature of history, which is very hard to do.
I really enjoyed the play. Actors, I think you guys all did a fantastic job. I think the play did a really good job of representing these three characters as historical figures and gave us as the audience a really good sense of the perspectives on the one hand of Stanton and Anthony and the other hand Douglas. I think we can talk about who was right, perhaps, in this panel, but we really get a good historical sense of what those two contesting perspectives were from the play.
All right, thank you. So that kind of leads me into my next question. Good job there. All right, so this play sets us at the moment that these three friends, Douglas, Anthony, and Stanton, who had been working together towards a common goal of universal suffrage, or the right to vote for all adult citizens, and the abolition of enslavement, well, they began to split, as we saw that here, right? So Douglas, in support of the 15th Amendment that would protect the rights of Black men, but did not include women, and Stanton and Anthony in disagreement. So we know what happened, but what do you think was right? You know, whose humanity deserved to be acknowledged first?
Well, in my Bible, as a Christian, Jesus said that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And so when I look at history from that perspective, African Americans were at the bottom. They were viewed as the last. And what Frederick Douglass was basically saying is because of oppression through slavery and Jim Crow, racism that took place at that time, African Americans should be at the first, in front, and that America justice should be rendered towards them. I think Frederick Douglass also was challenged by Stanton and Anthony because what they were saying is, yes, it's true that African Americans have dealt with oppression, but what about humanity? We all are human in the eyes of God, and that also includes women, and so women should be recognized, and they also recognize too. Wasn't mentioned in the play, but women played an integral role throughout the Civil War, particularly on the Union side. Harriet Tubman, she came to South Carolina with the Black Union troops down in the Low Country and helped free the slaves there. Look at Martha Schofield. She came from Pennsylvania. She was in Beaufort, migrated here to Aiken, and founded the Schofield Institute. And so both of those women, they did not have the right to vote. And so I think Anthony and Stanton did a good job of trying to persuade Frederick Douglass that yes, we do acknowledge the humanity of African Americans, but we want you to acknowledge the humanity of all Americans, and that includes women.
So I think the play did a good job of showing us that Stanton and Anthony aren't opposed to Black men voting. And Frederick Douglass certainly is not opposed to women voting. So they both agree that each other should have the vote. So then the question becomes, what is the historical context? What is possible in this moment? And at this particular moment, there isn't the political will in Congress to add women to the 15th Amendment. But there is, for the first time, the political will in Congress to give Black men the vote. And as Frederick Douglass articulated in this play, it is the Negro's hour, as the saying went at the time. So that's the one part of the context that I think is really important in shaping not who should come first, but who could come first. And the other part of it is need. There is a dire need Black people to have a vote in the South at this particular time. And it is just a fact that there is no equivalent to the KKK attacking women for being women anywhere in the United States at that point in time. So we have both the political will and the dire need for Black suffrage.
That's deep, y'all. Let's lighten it up just a little bit, but of course this is a serious topic. So, we know that women eventually gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, but what are some common misconceptions about women's suffrage and arguments that were against women's suffrage at the time?
So if anyone's coming on Friday, you have to tell Dr. Sproul that Dr. DeValvis told y'all. It's the number one thing. It is suffragist, not suffragette, if you're talking about America. She will get you. So that's the number one as a scholar of suffrage. It's the number one thing you gotta get straight. But my own personal, as someone who teaches women's history and also someone who looks at suffrage in the South, I guess something I wish more people would know is that to make the story of women's history and women's political activity and public activity just the story of suffrage is to really flatline everything else that's happening. At a time where suffrage is still considered so kind of too radical, during the 15th Amendment it still was too fringe, but women are being incredibly political. They've been involved in the temperance movement since the 30s and 40s. They are, after suffrage, or not after the 15th, they are club women. They're making these women's clubs to help and fix their neighborhoods. There are people advocating for property rights. And some people frankly think that divorce and property rights and getting that ironed out is more important than suffrage. So there are several and large groups of women that are not just suffragists, and especially when you get into the Progressive era. Some of them are trying to prioritize, like in this play, they were trying to prioritize. And also, just because you are against suffrage does not mean that you cannot be a woman in power either. We can see maybe a certain negative side of that, where white supremacist women in the South actually campaigned for suffrage on the grounds that it would stop certain undesirable people that were non-white from voting in their opinion. And so you see some people that are advocating for suffrage taking the language of Stanton and amplifying it. Rebecca Latimer Felton is a very common example of this, despite her suffrage activism. But then you also see people that, are really trying to fix their communities. They're active in their community. They're active about temperance and children's workers' rights. And really, suffrage is not the only thing. And some of them, frankly, think that focusing on suffrage is a distraction. So just because you're not suffrage doesn't mean you're necessarily anti-women's power or empowerment.
I'm going to piggyback, if I can, on something that Melissa said. You mentioned white women in the South sometimes enlarging this argument that Stanton leans into a little bit and we allude to in this play. And I think it's possible, as it is with any social movement, to idealize it and idealize the participants, particularly after the fact when we've forgotten some of the details. And one of the things that I was thinking about today in terms of this long suffrage movement, because of course it carries on well into the 20th century, is that suffragists, not suffragettes, they continue to make this argument that white women need the vote to counter the votes of Black men, recent immigrants, people in the context of American imperialism who might become citizens, like Filipinos. And so into the 20th century, we see suffragists making these arguments that are once again wrapped up in the bigger historical context. During imperialism, Carrie Chapman Catt, who's sort of Susan B. Anthony's successor in the movement in many ways, she argues that women can help uplift races around the world, like Filipinos, like Cubans, and therefore demonstrate that they have earned their citizenship and earned the vote. So these, what's the word I'm looking for? These sinews of racism that shine through in this play are very much continue for the duration of the suffragist movement.
And Stanton got in trouble for this. She actually wrote this in her newspaper, the Revolution, which was funded by Train, who was a white supremacist. And I also want to reflect that like the entire movement, this entire organization that they were part of, split into two, and it was not just men on one side. Many abolitionists and suffragist women actually split away from Anthony and Stanton and formed two groups. But yeah, that was true. Those words were true, and she got in trouble.
So, Dr. King, you mentioned those sinews of racism. So I'm going to go to one of our audience members' questions. You all may have noticed that there was a black woman on the stage being ignored for a good part of the play, right? So an audience member asks this question. So when talking about voter oppression and suffrage, why were women of color, particularly black women, not included in the conversation?
I think that's a great question. It goes back to America as a country of race, and how race plays a role in how we view each other as Americans, particularly in the context of history and culture. And so when you look at the fact that women of color were not directly involved in the conversation, it plays to that, particularly when you look at the time, the context in which there were images of racism that depict women of color, not only women of color, but people of color as a whole. And so when you look at that, particularly with politicians and how they view race politically, many of those views came down to laws and sometimes ignoring voices of people of color, which include women.
I've got a quick quote here, actually, that applies to that really well. Thank you, audience member. And like, so the group that are part of before it split was called the American Equal Rights Association. We actually have a quote from Sojourner Truth, who was very old at this point, but was a member of the organization. And she actually says that, quote, "If colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before." So you see some women, some black women are genuinely worried about this. But also, we have Ms. Wells Barnett.
Yeah, so Ida B. Wells, later Ida B. Wells Barnett becomes part of this conversation. She later debates Susan B. Anthony about the organization's later drift towards white supremacist women and their inclusion of white women who are in the South who are hostile to black women getting the vote. So black women are part of the conversation. They weren't necessarily part of the conversation in this three-person focused play today. I also want to bring up something that the historian Tara Hunter has talked about. She is a black woman historian of black women. And something that she points out is that in the early years after the 15th Amendment, that black women and black children were very much a part of the the political culture in black communities that helped get out the vote. They went to voting booths with men, they encouraged people to vote, they celebrated on election day, and she makes the point that a lot of black women are very much a part of this culture of voting right after the 15th Amendment, and some of them understand black men as voting for their interests as a community. So it's not how today we tend to think about voting, but it's definitely a part of the culture in the immediate aftermath of the 15th Amendment.
Thank you. I'm going to go to another audience question. This one's more opinionated here. So, I don't know, you can throw some factors here too. Do you believe if women had been able to vote with the 15th Amendment, any laws would have been changed faster that helped women have more rights in general, and to help get rid of the children's workers law.
Children's workers law, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And could you expand on what the children's workers law was?
Yeah, so at this time period, this is, well, in the 1860s, it's still very, very fleshly. But we're getting into kind of this progressive workers' rights movement, in which we still have extremely young children working in factories in very long hours. We don't have a lot of, we have the the USDA doesn't exist, there's not a lot of health codes or anything like this. And so a lot of women are actively campaigning to lower the working hours, if not the working hours of children. And sometimes actually lower the working hours of women, and sometimes actually use the language of like weaker women to get what they want. So sometimes women actually weaponize this language, this what we call sexism, to get what they want, which is quite interesting. So I definitely think I think the child labor laws will definitely change because we see a huge wave of women who are really pushing their congressmen to make this change. And so we actually saw that happen successfully because of women. So yeah, I think really if they could vote, it would accelerate it. However, in the South, even after women get the vote in the 19th Amendment, you don't see a lot of white women voting, and of course, you don't see black women voting for civil rights and the lack thereof.
Another cause that women really get behind in increasing numbers in the late 19th and into the 20th century is temperance and then prohibition. And a lot of women make the argument that we need the vote to get prohibition because women are disproportionately affected by too much money being spent on alcohol and on domestic abuse that flows from alcohol use. So I think the movement towards prohibition might have been faster if women had the vote earlier.
All right. So another question. Frederick Douglass, with his hair, proved himself to be seen as an educated and successful black man. And Anthony, showing her forward style with her bloomers, is showing that she too can get work done. But in the play, they're both fighting to be heard. So in what ways do you see that still happening today? These groups fighting to be heard?
From my observation, it's a beautiful thing. You look at the fact that there's a long history of African Americans and women coming together, fighting for equality and social justice. And so history does repeats itself. And just like Alex Tocqueville mentioned in his book, Democracy of America, that America is a country of voluntary associations. And so it's good to see that. And although there are disagreements between the African American community and women, but because of our history of oppression overall, African American women come together to collaborate on issues, particularly as it relates to voting.
Thank you. So I have one for the actors now. Okay.
Sorry.
So what's the most interesting thing you learned in the research for your role? And that's for anyone. Go ahead.
That's your last question was.
Okay.
And I said this when we did the little morning thing, on the commercial for it, whatever. If you think about in the 1860s, the two main topics here are men, black men are trying to stop themselves from being killed. Women are trying to stop men from speaking for them over their own issues. And if you think about it like that, not much has changed.
The only thing that changed was the date. Okay. Anyone else?
Well, I think it's just a big part of it is we all respect these figures from history, but in researching them, I mean, there's a lot of things, especially my character said, was terrible and I don't agree with at all, but she did do a lot of great things at the same time. And I think that's all of us. We're all flawed, you know?
One thing I think I've learned, a couple of things, is one, I don't think we're learning our real history. Frederick Douglass, I knew a lot about him, but not enough to know, not more than she knew. One thing I didn't know is he accomplished all this, majority of this, as a runaway slave. And that blew my mind. And you hear about him as a great orator, but then you realize this man was never taught how to read. He taught himself. He taught himself. And when you start to study the history of him, you hear a lot of people bring up the bad about him, but I'm like, this man wasn't a perfect man, but he was perfect for that time. And so it's just it was a mind. It blew my mind. I was like, man, I need to go back to school.
Well, we have some great historians on the stage.
Friday.
Oh, yeah, we'll have on Friday. All right, anyone else who we have? All right. Well, I think we have time for one more question. Oh. Okay. So here's a fun one, right? If you had the chance to ask the real life Douglas, Anthony, or Stanton a question in real life, what would it be? And that's for anyone on the stage. You had a chance to ask.
How did he get his hair? Keep it while he's walking.
I could explain it to you, but I'm not going to. What would be your question?
We knew this question was coming, I was like, oh.
Anyone in the audience, would you ask them a question?
Where did you find the courage?
I think I'd ask Douglas more about his life, whatever questions I still had. Especially like even though he wrote his narrative under slavery, there's still so few slave narratives that we have, and so to just make him expound, like tell me more, because it's such a rare resource. I think as a historian who studies that, I would love to have more sources as compared to the few that we have, because it took, as someone mentioned, such bravery to do it, let alone dictate your experiences. So yeah, I would drill him on just more.
That's wild, right? So he wrote his own slave narrative, not knowing how to read or write until he taught himself. Wrote it, being a fugitive, had to escape the United States. Came back from Europe, different man almost, and was still a fugitive. And still went around the mostly northeastern United States on a speaking tour against abolition.
If you read his narrative, it's impossible to realize that he taught himself how to read. I mean, this is an educated man. When you read the narrative, it's an educated person, and you go, what? He had to trick kids into teaching them the letters.
All right, yeah.
I think that if I could bring Anthony Stanton and Douglas back from the dead today, I would ask them how they would have approached this conversation differently. A, if they knew that women got vote 2 decades into the 20th century, but also that it took that long. And if they knew that Black people in half of this country could not effectively vote until 1965. I wonder how that would change the conversation if they could have had that foresight in either direction.
And knowing that voter suppression is still happening today. Right? Yeah.
I think my biggest, my question would be for both Anthony and Douglas is, with all your accomplishments, what are your regrets? What do you regret not doing? What did you take to your grave that you regret? I wish I would have just done this.
I think the more you accomplish, the more you regret. You wish you could have done more.
Yeah, always, right? So we are going to end on that sad note. here for another 45 minutes, I could get to them all. What I'll do with these questions, though, we have some wonderful panelists, and I have their email addresses. I could send you all these questions, and maybe some way, shape, or form, we could share these with folks. We'll figure it out, okay, to get some answers to your questions. But I do want to thank again our sponsors, the Smithsonian, the Museum on Main Street, SC Humanities, and a special thanks to our planning committee, the Aiken Community Theater Board, the USC Aiken History Club, those are those young folks out there that you saw ushering and helping us out, and of course, the Etherredge Center. So I'm going to leave you all with some of the words that you heard back in the play, with the advice of Frederick Douglass. Agitate, agitate, agitate.